Cold War, Part 2. And this time, it's personal. You took a shot at the Cold War test. You studied, you tried hard, you took it, got your test score back. Don't like your test score, want to make it better. You have come to the right place. Now what you need is your piece of paper that your teacher has given you that has all the blanks on it. Now you are going to follow along this video, and text is going to come flying all over the PowerPoint screen. When it comes in, I want you to look for what is in red. What is in red is what you want to write down in the blank. When you are done, you're going to create the most premium study guide, and you're going to take that study guide and make note cards from it. You will study those note cards, study this study guide, and you will take this test part 2 and kick a little booty, because this time it is personal. It's also a little cold in here. Let's talk about this Cold War. What's the difference between a hot war and a Cold War? A hot war is when the two sides are fighting directly. A Cold War is not direct fighting, but it's really close to war. And what are these two sides? Of course, that would be the United States of America and the Soviet Union. So let's pick up the Cold War in the 1960s, shall we? Number 1, you see right up here we're on number 1, so look at number 1 on your study guide. The Cold War made foreign policy a major issue in every presidential election during this period. And what we mean by foreign policy is, how are you going to deal with the Soviet Union? How are you going to deal with communism as it looks to spread all over the globe? That is foreign policy. Alright, so what are those two ideas, or what are two foreign policies for how to deal with communism? Well, the first one we learned about before, and that is containment. Harry Truman's, it was called the Truman Doctrine, is containment of communism. And what that means is, we're not going to invade North Korea, we're not going to invade the Soviet Union, but what we might do is say, hey, if the Soviet Union looks to spread, or if North Korea looks to spread, we're going to stop the spread of communism. That is containment. Harry Truman's presidency ends, and he is replaced by Dwight Eisenhower, war hero from World War II. His policy, he keeps containment, but he's got a different idea too, and it's called massive retaliation. Please write in massive retaliation. It is designed to deter nuclear strikes by the Soviets. Now here's how it works. You tell the Soviet Union that if you ever even think about dropping an atomic bomb on us, we are going to respond by dropping every atomic bomb we have ever created on your face. You will not like that, which is the reason you will not drop an atomic bomb on us ever. That is how you deter nuclear strikes, is by threatening a gigantic strike of your own, and that is massive retaliation. But then Dwight Eisenhower's presidency ends, and he is replaced by President John F. Kennedy. Let's talk a little Kennedy. You got Kennedy? Write that in. I got a quote from Kennedy. Read and listen to the man with a plan.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
What does that mean? What does this mean? To support any friend, oppose any foe, pay any price, bear any burden? What are we talking about? We're talking about Harry Truman's policy. And what was that policy called? Containment. So what I need you to write in, and I know there's not a blank for this, but on number 3 after this quote, I want you to write in containment. Please put containment in. Got that? Write in that. That's a containment quote. But that wasn't his only quote. Here is another quote.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Please write in what you can do for your country. And what kind of a quote is this? Once you have finished writing in can do for your country, Below that, I want you to put service. Put service. And then draw an equal sign. Okay? What are we talking about with service? President Kennedy starts an organization called the Peace Corps. I want you to write in Peace Corps, spelled C-O-R-P-S, like military, but it's not military. It's a worldwide service organization staffed by the United States. You see, the idea of the Peace Corps is you make the United States look good. You send some of our best people across the globe to try to help other people out. And people say, you know what, this United States, this democracy, free market capitalism is a good thing. So changing hearts and minds is this quote right here. All right, so we got quotes. We got a presidency. Unfortunately, his presidency ends tragically. Number 5, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas in 1963. He was cut down by the bullets of Lee Harvey Oswald, and when he died, we are still on number 5. The event, write this in, shook the nation's confidence and began a period of internal strife in America. I'm not saying everything was just great before Kennedy died, but you were experiencing the post-World War II. Boom. The economy was good. President Kennedy was a decently popular president, and when he died, it was such a shock to have a president assassinated. It had been decades since that had happened, and it shook the nation's confidence, as all tragedies do, and began a period of internal strife where Americans were divided. Now, they're divided especially over U.S. involvement increasingly in Southeast Asia at a little place called Vietnam. Now, we're going to get to Vietnam in a second, but let's go to Cuba for a little bit. Let's go south of Florida. Because in the late 1950s, Fidel Castro, please write in Fidel Castro, led a communist revolution that took over Cuba. Cuba had a relatively corrupt leader, and Castro led a revolution, and quickly Castro decided that Cuba would be communist. And this happens in the late 1950s, but because we're in the Cold War in the 60s, all the action is going to happen in the 1960s. You ready for some action? Here we go. First comes the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Bay of Pigs invasion in the early 1960s was the plan of the United States to get rid of Castro. It was to send Cuban exiles, folks who had left Cuba, come to America, send them back to Cuba to have an armed revolution. Unfortunately, the Bay of Pigs invasion wasn't supported well at all. It was a complete failure. It was a failed attempt by Cubans who fled to Florida to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. So Castro is a little worried now. What's going on with the United States of America trying to have these revolutions? And 1 year later, in 1962, nuclear weapons are stationed in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is when the Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, so close to the United States that nearly all major eastern cities were at threat of a nuclear attack. The world stood at the brink of nuclear war, and President Kennedy ordered these missiles to be removed. While the world stood off, waiting to see what happened, eventually, on the brink of nuclear war, right in on the brink of nuclear war, the Soviet leadership blinked and removed their missiles. So nuclear war would not happen in the early 1960s, even though that fear was widespread in the United States of America. When the Soviet Union got their missiles out of Cuba, this conflict was over. But once it goes away, we got a big conflict that is brewing in Vietnam. Let's talk about Vietnam real quick. What happened with Vietnam? Why did we get involved in Vietnam? Well, in the 1950s, communist North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam. Wait, time out. A communist country invaded a non-communist country. Are we going to stop them? That would be a yes. Why are we going to stop them? What policy? Is it massive retaliation? No, it's containment. The U.S. helped South Vietnam resist. This is the policy of containment. So how did the troop buildup start? You ready for this? Here we go. The American military buildup in Vietnam began under President John F. Kennedy. But the buildup intensified under President Lyndon Johnson. Now, I know what you're thinking. How am I supposed to ever remember this? Well, don't you worry, I just thought of a premium way first. Always to remember this. Kennedy kickstarts the war. Kennedy kickstarts, gets it going. Johnson jumps up. Troop numbers. Premium or non-premium? Of course, that's very premium. Now, the U.S. repeatedly defeated the North Vietnamese in battle. But the issue wasn't beating the Vietnamese in battle. It was getting them out of South Vietnam and ending the communist threat. This is hard to do because the United States fought write this in, a limited war and could not achieve a favorable end. There was a trail called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the North Vietnamese army would use it to go in and out of South Vietnam. It was not bombed because it was in Laos and Cambodia, but you get the point. There wasn't an all-out, do-everything-to-win attitude for the United States, and that was very harmful to get a victory. Now, America becomes increasingly divided over this war. This is the period of internal strife and division that I was talking about. So America is divided, and the activism was especially strong on college campuses, where you had fights between hawks and doves. A hawk was a person who was pro-war. A dove was a person who was anti-war. The college campuses that is most well known was Kent State University, where the National Guard fired on and killed several students in an attack in response to a protest that was happening on that campus. So we have great division in the United States over this war. The war will destroy the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. He will not seek re-election. And the next president of the United States is Richard Nixon. Please write in Nixon. He was elected on a pledge to bring the war to an honorable end. Like, we're going to win, and it's going to end, and it's all going to happen in my presidency. Now, he had a plan to do this, and his plan was called Vietnamization, which is just Vietnam with ization at the end. His policy of Vietnamization is this. You get rid of the U.S. troops. Let's get them out of there. Let's get them safe. Bring them over to the United States. Replace them with South Vietnamese forces. So now our guys aren't taking bullets anymore. The South Vietnamese are, because it's their country, so they should have a vested interest in not having it go communist. But you're still going to maintain military aid to South Vietnam. We're still going to have advisors over there to try to keep South Vietnam from going communist. Did it work? No. Vietnamization failed when South Vietnamese troops proved unable to resist an invasion by the Soviet-supplied. Look at that. The Soviet Union was helping North Vietnamese army. That shows this is a Cold War war with the Soviet Union completely involved. In 1975, North and South Vietnam merged under communist control. Please write in communist control. That's how we know that Vietnamization failed. If it worked, this merge never would have happened. There'd be two Vietnams, but today there's one Vietnam, and that Vietnam is completely communist. Therefore, Vietnamization was a failure. Now, war's over. But unlike the veterans of World War II who returned to a grateful and supportive nation, Vietnam veterans returned to face indifference or hostility from some who opposed the war. So they didn't get the grateful and supportive nation, they got the indifference. They got the hostility. Why? Because Vietnam was such an unpopular war. Why? Because World War II was a clear victory and Vietnam wasn't really so much a victory. So you have issues with veterans that are returning home. Would they ever be recognized for their sacrifice? Yes. Eventually, Vietnam veterans were recognized and honored for their service and sacrifice, and that is the building of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. that has the names of every single American troop who gave his life in the Vietnam War. During the Cold War, the U.S. military defended freedom in wars and conflicts that were not always popular. The Vietnam War wasn't always popular, but it helped, write this in, the ideals of democracy and freedom prevail in the struggle with Soviet communism. Next big topic, civil rights movement. Big organization that is key to the civil rights movement is the long name, write this out, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That would be the NAACP for short. What is the NAACP strategy in the civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s? It's the court system. It is to challenge segregation in court. So we're in fists, we're not throwing bombs, we are taking cases to court, taking issues to court. And the NAACP will be doing this. The biggest one they ever take to court was actually a bunch of cases all wrapped together called Brown versus Board of Education. And the question in Brown versus Board of Education was, should schools be integrated, white and black kids together, or should they be segregated? What was stated? The Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education stated that segregated schools are unequal and they must desegregate. So, the battle over, at least legally, whether or not schools should be integrated is over. You know what's the cool thing about this case? I said there's like 5 cases that were all wrapped together in Brown versus Board of Education. One of those was here in Virginia. The case included Davis versus Prince Edward County. That's kind of like center of the state, little south. And that is in Virginia. So there was an integration case that got wrapped up in a Brown versus Board of Education, which said that schools must desegregate. Who were the players that got all this stuff done? In Virginia, it's a guy named Oliver Hill on the left side right here. Oliver Hill was the NAACP legal defense leader in Virginia. And the overall NAACP legal defense guy was Thurgood Marshall right here. Thurgood Marshall was the head of the NAACP legal defense team. I know what you're thinking. How am I supposed to ever remember this? Well, don't you worry, because I just thought of a premium way first always to remember this. Oliver Hill is in Virginia because Virginia's got a lot of hills. Blue Ridge Mountains. Thurgood Marshall is the head of the legal defense team, the overall head, because he's really good to be the head. Alright, next topic. How did Virginia respond to Brown versus Board of Education? Well, they resisted. The first one, please write in, massive resistance. The closing of some schools. That county I told you about, Prince Edward County, is where the school system closed for 5 years. They just shut it down. They said, we are not going to integrate. No one will go to school. That is massive resistance. Virginia also responded by establishing private academies for white students. So in Prince Edward County, now that schools shut down, the white students still were educated, but they were educated in private academies. It was the African American students who did not receive any education. Now, eventually there would be complete integration in Virginia, but what would happen, last thing, is white flight from urban school systems. So as urban school systems would be integrated, more whites were likely to go to the suburbs rather than to face completely integrated city schools. So there's a change there. 3 ways that Virginia resisted Brown versus Board of Education. So this, obviously, the civil rights battle isn't close to being over. In 1963, there was a march on Washington led by Dr. Martin Luther King. And he gave a very famous speech. He gave his I Have a Dream speech. What did this march on Washington do? Well, number one, it demonstrated the power of nonviolent mass protest. There were hundreds of thousands of people at the March on Washington, and there was no violence. So you have a huge protest that is not violent. There's power in that. It also influenced public opinion in support of civil rights legislation. Okay, so it shows the power of their strategy, and it also gets people talking about civil rights legislation. Well, what would be that civil rights legislation? President Lyndon Johnson played an important role in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president who gets this stuff signed is Lyndon Johnson, and the first act is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What does it do? It prohibits discrimination based off race, color, gender, or national origin. So there can't be any more discrimination in public places that are getting taxpayer dollars. Discrimination done in those places. 2, it desegregated public accommodations. You know the thing, like, whenever you see a picture of Jim Crow laws, it's always the water fountain, right? Or it's always the bathroom. It says black here, white there. Can't do that anymore. Public accommodations are completely desegregated. That's great. But you know what's not great? Is African Americans still don't have full voting rights. Lyndon Johnson again? President Lyndon Johnson played a key role in the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What did it do? It outlawed literacy tests. So before, you had to take a test, proving that you had some basic intelligence, but the tests were really unfair and unfair towards African Americans. They're gone. You can't do a literacy test anymore. It sent federal registrars to the South to register voters and resulted in an increase in African American voters. So if you send folks down to the South to get those guys registered, that is going to increase the amount of voting power for African Americans in the South. Now, the civil rights movement was very successful, which is the reason that it's become a model for other groups, such as the Latino rights movement, have used to extend civil rights to promote equal justice. This is the use of nonviolent mass protest against laws that are perceived to damage their civil rights and not give them equal justice. Alright, let's talk about the 20th century Supreme Court for a bit. The Supreme Court has changed. Just the way that it looks has changed. There was a time that it was all just a bunch of white guys. That ain't the case anymore. The membership of the United States Supreme Court has included women and minorities. Now, there have been many, but let me just give you a few. Sandra Day O'Connor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Clarence Thomas. The first African American was Thurgood Marshall, the overall legal defense fund team. Today got Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. You have women and minorities on the Supreme Court, and that was not the case before. What does the Supreme Court do? The U.S. Supreme Court protects individual rights enumerated in the Constitution of the United States. What does enumerated mean? It means things that are actually written down. What is listed? The Bill of Rights, 10 enumerated rights that folks have. Well, Bill of Rights rights were guaranteed through many Supreme Court decisions in the 1960s, as individual rights enumerated in the Constitution were backed up. But that's not always the case, as in it's not always things written down. It can be things that are not written down. The United States Supreme Court identifies a constitutional basis for a right to privacy that is protected from government interference. There's nothing in the Bill of Rights that talks about a right to privacy, at least not in this case. I want you to write in next to right to privacy a Supreme Court case, Roe, R-O-E v. Wade, W-A-D-E, Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade established a right to privacy in the case of abortion, granting women the right to have an abortion. Now, this is important because this is incredibly divisive stuff. I mean, abortion is the hot button issue currently in American society. So don't act like all this stuff is just accepted, like, okay, everybody's done, we move on now. There's lots of disagreements over this, but there's no doubt that the Supreme Court has established a right to privacy in the case of abortion in Roe versus Wade. Last topic, space race. Let's go to space. In the early 1960s, President Kennedy pledged increased support for the American space program. If there is one president you can associate with the space program, it's John F. Kennedy. All right, so the race to the moon continued throughout the 1960s. If you get to the moon, you get to the finish line. Why do you want to get to the moon? Because it's made out of cheese, and cheese is delicious. 30. U.S. astronaut John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth. John Glenn goes around the Earth. He doesn't go to the moon. He just makes a full circle around the Earth. How do you remember this? Glenn glide. Glenn glide. John Glenn was gliding over the Earth. Who was the first guy to get to the moon? That's Neil Armstrong. Right in, Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong was the first person to step on the moon's surface. And when he did, he planted an American flag in that cheese. How do you remember Neil Armstrong? He must have had a strong arm to plant the flag in the cheese. Premium or non-premium? Of course that's premium. Sally Ride was your first female American astronaut. Sally Ride rode to space. Premium or non-premium? Does that help you at all? Of course it doesn't help you at all, so just remember it, okay? Sally Ride is the first female American astronaut. You know, this NASA program has done so much for the United States. Examples of technological advances thanks to the space program include space exploration, space shuttle, Mars rover, Voyager missions, the Hubble telescope, which gives us pictures of far out galaxies, global positioning systems, personal computers, and robotics.